The children never spoke of the elm grove behind the granary, not to visitors, not to the itinerant preachers who came through Harlan County in the lean months, not even among themselves once they'd passed a certain age. By the time they were 9 or 10, they understood that some silences were heavier than stone and that the weight was meant to be carried without complaint. The Pembridge property sat where 3 ridges converged, creating a natural basin that held fog until mid-morning most days of the year. The main house, built in 1867 by Samuel Pembridge upon his return from a war he never discussed, stood at the property's highest point. Below it, terraced into the hillside, were the tobacco fields, the corn plots, and finally, near the creek bed, the workers' cabins. By 1889, most of those cabins stood empty. The few that remained occupied housed families who had been there since before the war, or who had arrived in its immediate aftermath, when the mountain roads were full of people looking for anywhere that might take them. The Pembridge children, there were 4 who survived infancy, learned the property's geography, the way children learn the features of their own faces. They knew which stones in the creek could bear their weight, which paths through the laurel thickets were passable, where the spring ran coldest. They knew these things without needing to be taught, through the accumulated experience of days spent ranging across land their father considered his by right and by labor. What they also knew, though no one had ever explained it in direct terms, was that certain questions produced a particular kind of silence in adults. Questions about why the elm grove was never harvested for timber despite the quality of the trees. Questions about why no one ever walked through it, even as a shortcut to the lower fields. Questions about the names carved into some of the trunks, names that didn't match anyone currently living on the property or in the surrounding hollows. Margaret Pembridge, the eldest, was 12 in the summer of 1889. Her diary, discovered in 1953 during the demolition of the house, contained entries written in a careful, formal hand. She recorded the weather, the progress of crops, visits from relatives. She noted when her younger siblings were ill, when her mother's headaches kept her in darkened rooms for days at a time. On July 18, 1889, she wrote, "Father dismissed Isaiah and his family today. Mother said nothing at supper. Thomas asked where they would go, and Father told him it was not our concern. The house feels larger tonight, though that makes no sense." Isaiah Holcomb had worked the Pembridge land since 1871. His cabin was the one nearest the elm grove. His wife, Dinah, had helped with the washing and the kitchen work during harvest season. Their children, 3 boys who ranged from 7 to 14, had played with the younger Pembridge children when the adults were occupied. The departure of the Holcomb family was noted in the Harlan County tax records as a routine matter. Isaiah Holcomb, colored, removed from the Pembridge property to parts unknown, no forwarding address listed. Margaret's next entry came 3 days later. "Found Thomas crying behind the smokehouse. He wouldn't say why. When I pressed him, he said he'd seen something he shouldn't have. I told him we all see things we shouldn't, and that forgetting is a skill like any other. He looked at me as though I'd struck him." Thomas Pembridge was 8 years old that summer. In 1924, at the age of 43, he would give a deposition to a land surveyor who was attempting to document property boundaries for a railroad company. The deposition, preserved in the county clerk's office, is remarkable mainly for what it doesn't say. Thomas confirmed the location of various landmarks, described the property as it had been in his childhood, noted which structures were still standing and which had fallen into ruin. When asked about the elm grove, he stated, "That area was not used for farming or timbering. It was considered unsuitable for either purpose." When pressed to explain why, he replied, "I could not say with certainty. It was understood to be so." The summer of 1889 was unremarkable in most respects. The tobacco crop came in adequately. The corn was less successful, damaged by an early frost that no one had anticipated. Samuel Pembridge hired 2-day laborers from Harlan to help with the harvest, men who came at dawn and left before full dark, never staying overnight, never bringing families, never asking questions about anything other than the work immediately at hand. The Methodist circuit rider who visited in late August that year kept a journal of his travels. His entry for the Pembridge property was brief. Received hospitality from the Pembridge family. Good people, though the children seem unnaturally quiet. Mrs. Pembridge suffers from nerves. The property shows signs of former prosperity, now somewhat diminished. Noted an unusual number of abandoned structures, held evening prayers for the family. Pembridge wept throughout. What the circuit rider didn't record, because he had no reason to know of it, was the conversation that took place after he'd retired to the guest room. Margaret, who slept in the room adjacent, heard her parents talking in voices that weren't quite whispers. She wrote about it years later in a letter to her youngest sister, a letter that was never sent but was found among Margaret's effects after her death in 1947. Mother asked Father if it would ever be finished. She didn't say what it was, but I knew. I had always known, the way you know about thunder before you hear it. Father said it was finished long ago, that what remained was only the memory of it, and that memory would fade if we did our part. Mother asked what would happen if one of us spoke of it. Father said that wouldn't happen, because we had been raised to understand the difference between what serves a family and what destroys it. The elm grove consisted of approximately 40 trees, most of them mature specimens that would have been valuable as timber. The grove occupied a roughly circular area, perhaps 200 feet in diameter, situated on relatively flat ground between the workers' cabins and the creek. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an ideal location for additional cabins or for storage structures. Yet it remained untouched, the undergrowth allowed to grow dense and tangled, the trees dropping their leaves each autumn to form a thick carpet that was never disturbed. Local children sometimes dared each other to enter the grove, the way children everywhere dare each other to approach places that adults have marked as forbidden. But the Pembridge children never participated in these dares. When asked why, they would say only that they had better things to do, or that the grove was uninteresting, or that their father forbade it. The last explanation was technically true, though Samuel Pembridge had never needed to expressly forbid it. The prohibition was understood, woven into the fabric of daily life as thoroughly as the rules about washing hands before meals or saying grace before eating. In October of 1889, a traveling photographer came through Harlan County, offering to take family portraits for a reasonable fee. The Pembridge family sat for a photograph on the porch of the main house. The image, preserved in the County Historical Society, shows Samuel standing behind his seated wife, his hand on her shoulder. The 4 children are arranged around them, the younger 2 seated on the floor, Margaret and Thomas standing to either side. Everyone is dressed in their best clothes. No one is smiling, but that was typical of photographs from the period when long exposure times made it difficult to maintain a pleasant expression. What's notable about the photograph, though it's easy to miss, is the position of Thomas. He stands at the very edge of the frame, his body angled slightly away from the camera, his eyes not quite meeting the lens. Years later, a local historian would note that Thomas appeared to be looking toward the lower part of the property, toward the area where the elm grove would have been visible from the porch, though it doesn't appear in the photograph itself. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was harsh. Snow came early and stayed late. The Pembridge family, like most in the county, spent the long months maintaining the bare minimum required to keep people and animals alive. Margaret's diary entries from this period are sparse, often noting only the temperature or the depth of the snow. On December 30th, she wrote, "Father went down to check the empty cabins, to ensure the roofs haven't collapsed under the snow. He was gone for 3 hours, though the walk there and back should take no more than 30 minutes. When he returned, his clothes were soaked through, though it hadn't snowed since morning. Mother asked no questions. In March of 1890, when the snow finally began to melt, the creek flooded. This happened most years, and most years it caused only minor inconvenience, flooding the lowest fields and sometimes washing out the footbridge. But in 1890, the flooding was severe enough that Samuel Pembridge and his two eldest children had to work to divert the water before it reached the main house. They spent 2 days in cold rain, digging channels and building temporary berms from mud and stone. Thomas, working alongside his father and sister, said very little. But on the second day, according to Margaret's diary, he suddenly stopped digging and stared at something in the floodwater. When Margaret looked, she saw what appeared to be a piece of fabric, muddy and torn, caught on a submerged branch. Thomas reached for it, but Samuel ordered him to leave it alone. "Some things," Samuel said, "are better left to the current." The fabric worked itself loose and disappeared downstream. Margaret wrote, "Thomas's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the shovel. I wanted to tell him it was nothing, just an old rag from one of the cabins, but we both knew that wasn't true. By spring, the family's situation had become more precarious." Samuel Pembridge was not destitute, but the combination of poor harvests and the broader economic troubles of the period had left him with less margin than he was accustomed to. He needed help with the planting, but he was reluctant to bring in workers who might stay on the property for any length of time, who might wander, who might notice things and ask questions. He eventually hired a man named Caleb Worth, who had a reputation for being capable but solitary, the kind of worker who did his job and kept his observations to himself. Caleb was given the cabin furthest from the elm grove, the one that had belonged to the Holcomb family before they left. He was told, as all workers were told, that he could range over most of the property, but that the area around the elm grove was to be avoided. Samuel offered no explanation for this restriction, and Caleb, true to his nature, asked for none. Caleb worked the Pembridge land for 2 seasons. During that time, he ate his evening meals at the main house, attended the Methodist services when the circuit rider came through, and generally conducted himself as a man who understood the value of steady work and limited curiosity. The Pembridge children grew accustomed to his presence. Margaret, now 13, noted in her diary that Caleb seemed older than his years, as though he carried some private burden. She didn't elaborate on what made her think this, and Caleb himself never spoke of his past or his future. In August of 1890, Caleb failed to appear for the morning work. Samuel found him in his cabin, ill with what appeared to be a fever. Caleb was delirious, speaking words that made no sense to Samuel, who had limited patience for sickness in others. Samuel left water and some food, told Caleb to rest, and returned to the main house. That evening, Caleb was worse. His fever had climbed, and he was no longer fully conscious. Samuel sent Margaret to fetch the nearest neighbour who had some knowledge of medicine, a widow named Mrs. Carver, who lived 2 hollows over. Mrs. Carver arrived after dark. She examined Caleb by lantern light, administered what remedies she had, and told Samuel that the fever would either break within the next day or it would kill him. There was nothing more to be done. She accepted payment in the form of eggs and a small bag of cornmeal, and she left, picking her way down the dark path with a confidence born of long familiarity with these mountains at night. Caleb Worth died sometime before dawn. Samuel found him when he went to check on him at first light. The cause of death was recorded in the county register as fever, which was true enough in a technical sense. Samuel paid for a simple burial in the Methodist cemetery, 5 miles from the Pembridge property. The service was attended by Samuel, the circuit rider, and 2 men from Harlan who had known Caleb slightly. None of the Pembridge children were present. Margaret wrote, "Father says Caleb is buried and that's the end of it, but Thomas heard him talking to Mother late last night. Father said Caleb had been asking questions, nothing specific, just the kind of questions a man asks when he notices things don't fit together properly. Mother asked if that was why Caleb took sick. Father said sickness is sickness, and that it was a mercy it happened when it did, before the autumn work began, and we would have had to find a replacement in mid-season. "I don't know what to make of this. I don't know what I'm meant to make of it." After Caleb's death, Samuel hired no more residential workers. He brought in day laborers when absolutely necessary, men who arrived at dawn and left before the light failed, men who had no reason to linger, no reason to develop familiarity with the property beyond what was required for the immediate task. The workers' cabins stood empty. The Pembridge children were old enough now to help with the lighter work, and Samuel and his wife managed the rest through sheer determination and an unwillingness to acknowledge the toll it took on them both. The elm grove remained undisturbed. In summer, the leaves formed a thick canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. In winter, the bare branches created a lattice of shadows that seemed to shift and move, even when there was no wind. Animals avoided the grove. Birds rarely nested in the trees. This was attributed by some to the density of the undergrowth, by others to the quality of the soil, by still others to simple chance. But those who had lived on or near the Pembridge property long enough tended not to speculate about the grove at all. It was there. It was not to be entered, and that was sufficient. In 1892, Thomas Pembridge, now 11 years old, began to keep a journal of his own. His entries were irregular and often brief, but they provide a window into the mind of a child growing up with the weight of unspoken knowledge. On May 3, 1892, he wrote, "Helped father repair the fence near the creek. We worked within sight of the grove. Father never looked toward it, not once, though it was directly in our line of sight for hours. I tried to do the same, to keep my eyes on the work, but I couldn't help myself. The trees look like they're standing guard over something. Father says trees are just trees, that we make them into symbols because we don't know how else to manage what we feel." I don't know if I believe him. That summer, Margaret began to prepare for a future that would take her away from the property. At 15, she was old enough to work as a teacher in one of the county's small schools, assuming she could demonstrate sufficient education. Her mother taught her the finer points of deportment and household management. Her father, with evident reluctance, agreed that she would need to be able to leave eventually, that the mountain had a way of keeping people longer than was good for them. Margaret's preparations included a survey of her own education, an attempt to determine what she knew and what gaps remained. She read what books were available in the house: a Bible, a partial set of encyclopedias, several volumes of history and natural philosophy. She practiced her handwriting, copying passages from these books to improve her penmanship, and she wrote in her diary about the future she imagined. "I will live somewhere with straight roads and regular mail service. I will teach children who don't carry secrets that age them before their time. I will forget the sound of wind in the elms, the way it sounds almost like voices if you listen long enough. Mother says forgetting is not the same as healing, but perhaps it's close enough." In September of that year, a lawyer from Harlan came to the Pembridge property to discuss a boundary dispute with a neighbouring landowner. The lawyer, a man named Grafton, was methodical and thorough. He walked the property lines with Samuel, making notes, comparing the physical reality against the descriptions in the deed. At one point, their path brought them near the elm grove. Grafton paused, studying the area, then consulted his papers. "This section here," Grafton said, indicating the grove, "isn't mentioned in the boundary description. It's as though the deed was written around it, if that makes sense. As though whoever wrote it was careful not to include it in the legal description of the property." Samuel replied that the grove had always been there, that it had never been used for anything, that it would be more trouble than it was worth to clear it. Grafton accepted this explanation, or at least didn't challenge it. He made a note in his papers and moved on. But that evening, before he left, he mentioned to Samuel that he'd noticed something odd about the property records. Several of the workers who had been listed on the tax rolls in the 1870s and early 1880s had no departure records, no evidence of where they'd gone when they left Pembridge land. It wasn't unusual, Grafton said, for records to be incomplete, especially for coloured workers and poor whites who moved frequently in search of work. But the number who simply disappeared from the records was higher than usual. Samuel said that men moved on when they felt like it, that he didn't keep track of them once they left his employ, that their whereabouts were none of his concern. Grafton agreed that this was reasonable. He finished his drink, thanked the Pembridge family for their hospitality, and rode back to Harlan. He never returned to the property. Margaret wrote, "Mr. Grafton asked Father about the men who used to work here. Father's face went very still, the way it does when he's angry but won't show it. After Mr. Grafton left, Father told Mother that lawyers are worse than preachers, always poking into things that don't concern them. Mother said perhaps we should have been more careful about the records. Father said the records were fine, that no one looks at records for coloured and poor whites, that we could have written anything or nothing and it would have made no difference. I wanted to ask what we had written, what we should have been careful about, but I know better than to ask." By 1893, the property was clearly in decline. The fields that had once been productive now yielded less each season. The main house needed repairs that Samuel couldn't afford to make properly. The workers' cabins were beginning to collapse, their roofs caving in under the weight of accumulated snow and rot. The Pembridge family persisted, but it was the persistence of people who knew they were fighting a losing battle and were simply too stubborn or too frightened to concede. Thomas, now 12, was old enough to help with the heavier work. He learned to handle tools with competence, to judge the weather, to manage the small crises that arose on any working farm. But he also developed habits that worried his sister. He would stop in the middle of a task and stare toward the lower part of the property. He would wake in the night and sit by his window, looking out at the darkness. He grew thin, as though he couldn't quite summon the appetite to eat properly. Margaret tried to talk to him, but Thomas had learned the family lesson well. There were things that should not be spoken of, and attempting to speak of them only made them more present, more impossible to ignore. When Margaret pressed, he would say only that he was tired, or that he'd been having bad dreams, or that he was worried about the harvest. None of these explanations was entirely false, but none was entirely true either. In June of 1893, a storm brought down a section of the fence that marked the boundary between the Pembridge property and the nearest neighbour's land. Samuel and Thomas spent a day repairing it, working in the heat, the air thick and still in the way it gets before afternoon thunderstorms. They worked mostly in silence, each focused on his own task. At one point, Thomas asked his father why they had never sold the Elm Grove timber. It was a question he had asked before, in different ways, but never so directly. Samuel continued working for several moments before answering. When he did, his voice was careful and deliberate. "Some timber isn't worth the trouble of cutting it," Samuel said. "The elms are old. The wood would be full of knots and weak spots. By the time you paid men to cut it and haul it, you'd barely break even. Better to leave it standing." Thomas accepted this answer, or appeared to. But he asked another question. "Are there people buried there?" Samuel's hands stopped moving. He looked at his son with an expression Margaret, who was watching from a distance, later described as terrible and sad, as though father was seeing Thomas clearly for the first time and didn't like what he saw. "What makes you ask that?" Samuel said. "I've heard things," Thomas replied. "Not from anyone specific, just heard things. The way people mention it when they think children aren't listening." Samuel set down his tools. "There are things in this world," he said, "that men do because they feel they have no choice, and there are things men do because they have a choice and make the wrong one. And sometimes there's no clear line between the two. You're old enough now to understand that life isn't simple, that people carry burdens they don't talk about, that sometimes the best thing you can do is carry your part of the burden and not ask where it came from or where it's going." Thomas said nothing. Samuel picked up his tools and resumed working. They finished the fence repair in silence, and they never had that conversation again. That summer, Margaret left to take a teaching position in a town 40 miles away. It was the first time she had been away from the property for longer than a day or two. Her mother wept when she left, though she tried to hide it. Her father gave her what money he could spare and told her to write regularly. Her younger siblings watched her go, with what Margaret later described as a mixture of envy and relief, as though I was escaping something but also abandoning them to it. Margaret's letters home were dutiful but increasingly impersonal. She wrote about her work, the students, the family she boarded with. She asked polite questions about the farm, the weather, the health of family members. She never asked about the grove. She never mentioned the conversations she'd overheard, the things she'd seen, the weight she'd carried for as long as she could remember. In a letter to a friend years later, she wrote, "I thought distance would help me forget, but you don't forget these things. You just get better at pretending you have." Back on the property, life continued in its diminished way. The harvest of 1893 was poor, the winter was difficult. By spring of 1894, Samuel was considering selling part of the property, though he was reluctant to do so. The problem, as he explained to his wife, was that any buyer would want to survey the land, would want to understand what they were purchasing, would want to walk the property and assess its value. And that would mean questions about the grove, about why it was left standing, about what made that section of the property unsuitable for farming or timbering. Samuel's wife, whose name was Catherine, and who appears in these records only in her relation to her husband, suggested that perhaps the time had come to clear the grove. Not for timber. The explanation Samuel had given Thomas was genuine. The wood was of poor quality, but simply to eliminate it as a feature of the landscape. To plough it under, plant it, make it indistinguishable from any other part of the property. Samuel considered this. He spent several days walking the property, looking at the grove from different angles, calculating what it would take to clear it. But in the end, he decided against it. The reasons he gave were practical. It would require hiring workers, and workers would ask questions. It would require disturbing the soil, and he didn't know what might be found if the soil were disturbed. It would draw attention, and attention was the last thing they needed. The real reason, which he didn't articulate even to himself, was that the grove served a purpose as it was. It marked the boundary of something, held something in place, provided a physical manifestation of an understanding that existed beyond words. To destroy it would be to release whatever it contained, not in any supernatural sense, but in the sense that the family and the property would no longer have a focal point for their collective forgetting. Thomas, now 13, was beginning to show signs of the man he would become. He was quiet, withdrawn, given to long periods of solitary contemplation. He completed his work adequately but without enthusiasm. He spoke little at meals, answered questions with the minimum required response, and spent his free time walking the property alone. His mother worried about him, but she didn't know how to help him, and his father maintained that boys needed to work through things in their own time and their own way. In July of 1894, Thomas was repairing the door on one of the collapsed cabins, not because there was any plan to use the cabin again, but because Samuel wanted to keep the structures from collapsing entirely, to maintain at least the appearance that the property was being maintained. Thomas was working alone, as was often the case now. The afternoon was hot and still. He had been working for several hours when he decided to rest in the shade. He sat with his back against the cabin wall, looking out over the lower part of the property. From this vantage point, he could see the elm grove clearly. The trees stood in their accustomed silence, the undergrowth thick between them. There was nothing obviously unusual about them. They were simply trees growing in a place where they had always grown. But as Thomas sat there, tired and hot and half asleep, he saw something he had never seen before. Or perhaps it was something he had seen many times, but had never allowed himself to fully register. Between the trees in the thickest part of the undergrowth, There were irregular depressions in the ground. From a distance, they could be dismissed as natural features, animal burrows or places where rainwater collected. But looking at them now, with the particular quality of light that comes in late afternoon, Thomas could see that they were too regular, too deliberately spaced. They were not natural features. They were graves. Thomas stood up. He looked at the grove for a long time, standing absolutely still. Then he picked up his tools and walked back to the main house. He found his father in the barn, sorting through equipment that needed repair. He set down his tools and said, "I know what's in the grove." Samuel looked at his son. His expression was unreadable. "Yes," he said finally, "I expect you do." They stood in silence. Outside, birds sang. The sound of Catherine's voice drifted from the house, calling the younger children to some task. The world continued in its normal way, indifferent to the conversation taking place in the dim barn. "How many?" Thomas asked. "I don't know exactly," Samuel said. 8, perhaps. Perhaps more. It was a long time ago." "What happened to them?" Samuel set down the tool he'd been holding. "They were leaving. Most of them wanted to go after the war to try their luck somewhere else. But some of them knew things, or had questions about things, or weren't inclined to keep quiet about what they knew or suspected. Your grandfather was a hard man, Thomas. Harder than I am, harder than you can probably imagine. He believed that some people had to be kept in their place, and that sometimes keeping them in their place required permanent solutions." Thomas's face had gone very pale. "And you?" "I was younger than you are now when it started. By the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, it was already done. I didn't—" Samuel stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I didn't stop it. I don't know if I could have stopped it, but I didn't try. And after it was done, after my father died and the property became mine, I had to decide what to do about it. I could have gone to the authorities, told them what I knew. But that would have destroyed the family, destroyed your mother and your siblings and you, so I decided to keep silent, to let the dead stay buried, to make sure no one had reason to disturb them. The workers who left," Thomas said slowly. "Isaiah and the others. Did they know?" "Isaiah suspected. I don't know how much he actually knew, but he was asking questions, the way Caleb did later. I gave him money and told him to take his family and go, and never to come back, and never to speak of what he might have seen or heard. He took the money. I don't know where he went. I don't know if he kept his silence because he was paid to or because he was afraid to do otherwise. I don't know, Thomas, and I've learned not to think about it too much." Thomas absorbed this. "And now I know," he said. "Yes," Samuel said. "Now you know. The question is what you're going to do with the knowing." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He looked around the barn, at the tools and equipment, the accumulated materials of a working life. "Nothing," he said finally. "I'm going to do nothing, because doing anything else would mean tearing apart everything we are, and I don't know if that would make anything better or just make it worse in a different way." Samuel nodded. "That's the choice I made. I won't tell you it's the right choice. I'll only tell you it's the choice that keeps this family together, that keeps food on the table, that keeps your mother from having to face what her father-in-law was and what her husband allowed to continue by his silence. They never spoke of it again. Thomas returned to his work. Samuel returned to his. The afternoon passed into evening, and evening into night, and the family ate dinner together and went to their beds. And nothing had changed, except that now 2 people in the house carried the full weight of the knowledge, instead of one. Margaret learned the truth years later, in a letter from Thomas, written shortly before his death in 1931. The letter was found among her possessions, never mentioned to anyone. In it, Thomas wrote, "You always knew something, Maggie. All of us did. But knowing in the vague way that children know is different from knowing in the specific way that adults know. I've carried the specific knowledge for 37 years now. It doesn't get lighter. You just get stronger at carrying it, until you can barely remember what it felt like not to carry it. I'm writing this now because I don't want to die with it entirely unspoken. I don't expect you to do anything with this information. I don't expect you to forgive Father or forgive me for keeping silent. I only want you to know that I understand now why he made the choice he did, even if I can't say whether it was the right choice. Margaret never responded to the letter. She kept it, which suggests it meant something to her, but she never spoke of it, never used it to confront the past or seek any kind of resolution. She lived another 16 years after Thomas died, working as a teacher, never marrying, never returning to Harlan County for longer than was absolutely necessary. When she died, her possessions were sorted by a niece who found the letter and, not understanding its significance, nearly threw it away before deciding to keep it simply because it was old and seemed important to someone. By 1895, the Pembridge property was struggling to remain viable. Samuel had sold some of the equipment, had let more of the fields go fallow, had reduced the household to the barest minimum required for survival. The main house needed repairs he couldn't afford. The outbuildings were collapsing. The property looked, as one neighbor noted, like a place that was being actively forgotten, even while people still lived there. The younger Pembridge children, now in their early teens, were growing into the same kind of wary silence that had characterized Margaret and Thomas. They asked few questions, made few demands, seemed to understand that their role was to endure rather than to thrive. Catherine Pembridge, worn down by years of hard work and private knowledge, suffered increasingly from the headaches that would eventually confine her to her bed for weeks at a time. In September of that year, a journalist from a Cincinnati newspaper traveled through the region, writing a series of articles about economic conditions in rural Appalachia. He stopped at the Pembridge property and requested permission to interview the family. Samuel initially refused, but the journalist was persistent, arguing that the story he wanted to tell was about the resilience of mountain families, the dignity of hard work, the values that kept communities together even in difficult times. Samuel eventually agreed to a brief interview. The journalist, whose name was Hamilton, asked questions about farming practices, about the challenges of mountain agriculture, about how families managed during economic downturns. Samuel answered carefully, providing information that was true but not revealing, helpful but not intimate. The conversation proceeded smoothly until Hamilton asked about the empty workers' cabins, about what had happened to the families who had lived there. Samuel explained that workers had moved on in search of better opportunities, that this was normal in the mountain economy, that men went where the work was. Hamilton accepted this explanation, but noted, as Grafton the lawyer had noted before him, that the number of workers who had simply disappeared from the area seemed unusually high. Samuel said that disappeared was too strong a word, that these men had simply moved on and hadn't maintained contact, which was also normal. Hamilton said he understood, made some notes, and changed the subject. But after he left, Thomas, who had been present during the interview, told his father that Hamilton hadn't believed him. "He didn't need to believe me," Samuel said. "He just needed to not have enough evidence to justify investigating further. And he doesn't. No one does. The people who might have provided evidence are gone, one way or another, and the people who remain know better than to speak." "What about us?" Thomas asked. "What about when we're gone? We carry it until we can't carry it anymore, and then we're gone. And the land remains, and eventually someone else comes along who doesn't know and doesn't need to know. And the whole thing becomes something that might have happened or might not have, a story that sounds true but can't be verified, a rumor that eventually loses even the solidity of rumor and becomes just another vague unease that people feel when they walk certain parts of certain properties." Hamilton's article appeared several weeks later. What happens to the knowledge then? Samuel considered this. "It dies with us," he said. "That's what's supposed to happen. That's how families manage things that can't be managed any other way." It mentioned the Pembridge family briefly, describing them as representative of the mountain farming families who continue to work marginal land despite decreasing returns. There was no mention of the workers' cabins, no mention of the elm grove, nothing that suggested Hamilton had found anything worth investigating further. The article moved on to other families, other properties, other examples of rural economic struggle. Catherine Pembridge read the article and wept. When Samuel asked why, she said she didn't know, that perhaps it was simply the relief of having survived the interview without anything worse happening. Samuel didn't contradict her, but he understood that her tears were about more than relief. They were about the exhaustion of maintaining silence, the cost of protection, the weight of choices made long ago by people who were now dead, but whose decisions continued to shape the lives of those who survived them. By 1897, Margaret had been away from the property for 4 years. She had established herself as a capable teacher, had developed a reputation for patience and clarity, had begun to build a life that had nothing to do with Harlan County or the Pembridge property. She wrote home less frequently now, and when she did write, her letters were brief and generic. She asked after her siblings, sent small amounts of money when she could, and never mentioned the possibility of returning. In one letter to her mother she wrote, "I am well, the school is good, the town is pleasant, I have no particular news to share. I think of you often, though perhaps not in the way you might hope. I think of you as someone who survived what might have broken a weaker person, and I take from that whatever strength I can. I hope you understand that my distance is not rejection, but self-preservation. I hope you understand that I love you even as I need to remain apart from you." Catherine kept the letter in a drawer, never showing it to Samuel, never mentioning it to anyone. Years later, after Catherine's death, Margaret found the letter among her mother's things and was surprised to see that it had been read so many times the paper was beginning to separate along the folds. She had not realized when she wrote it that it would mean so much, or that her mother would return to it again and again, looking for comfort or understanding or simply confirmation that the distance between them was natural rather than pathological. Thomas, now 16, was effectively running the property. Samuel's health was beginning to fail, not dramatically, not in any way that suggested immediate crisis, but in the gradual way that men fail when they have worked hard for too long under too much strain. Thomas managed the remaining fields, handled what little business the property still generated, and made decisions about which structures to maintain and which to let collapse. He did this with competence but without joy, with the understanding that he was managing decline rather than building toward any kind of future. His younger siblings looked to him for guidance, and he provided it in the same measured, careful way his father had. He taught them how to work, how to endure, how to carry things that shouldn't be carried. He taught them, though never in so many words, that some questions should never be asked, that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, that loyalty to family sometimes required betrayal of every other principle. In August of 1898, the county sheriff came to the property. His name was Morrison, and he was new to the position, elected after the previous sheriff died of a stroke. Morrison was thorough in the way that new officials often are, determined to demonstrate competence, to show that he took his responsibilities seriously. He had been reviewing old cases, old complaints, old mysteries that his predecessor had left unresolved. He told Samuel that he'd been looking into the disappearances of several workers from various properties in the county, men who had been recorded as employed in 1 year's tax census and were gone the next, with no record of where they had gone. Most of these disappearances were old, dating back to the 1870s and early 1880s, but there were enough of them, spread across enough properties, to suggest a pattern. Samuel asked what kind of pattern Morrison thought he was seeing. Morrison said he wasn't sure yet, that he was simply trying to understand why so many men seemed to have vanished without leaving forwarding addresses or relatives who claimed them or any evidence of their continued existence. Samuel said that men moved frequently, that workers in particular tended to be transient, that it was the nature of the mountain economy. Morrison agreed that this was true. But he noted that some of the missing men had wives and children, had roots in the community, had reasons to stay in contact with people they left behind, and yet there was no contact, no letters, no inquiries about property or wages owed, nothing. It was as though they had simply ceased to exist. Samuel said he couldn't speak to what had happened on other properties. As for his own property, workers had left when they chose to leave, and he had never prevented anyone from going or required anyone to stay. If they hadn't maintained contact, that was their choice and their business, not his. Morrison accepted this explanation, or appeared to. He asked if he could walk the property, just to get a sense of the layout, to understand the geography. Samuel agreed, with the stipulation that Morrison be accompanied, as the property had areas that were dangerous, old wells, unstable structures, that sort of thing. Morrison said that was fine, that he appreciated the concern for his safety. Thomas accompanied Morrison on the walk. They covered most of the property, the fields, the main house, the barn, the collapsed cabins. Morrison asked questions about the history of the place, about how many workers had lived there at the property's peak, about what had caused the decline. Thomas answered with the same careful honesty his father had demonstrated, providing information that was true but not revealing, helpful but not incriminating. As they walked, they drew near to the elm grove. Morrison paused, looking at the trees. "That's unusual," he said. "A stand of timber like that, left unharvested. Is there something wrong with the wood?" Thomas repeated his father's explanation. The wood was of poor quality, full of knots, not worth the trouble of cutting and hauling. Morrison nodded, but he continued to study the grove. "Mind if I take a closer look?" he asked. Thomas said he didn't mind, but that the undergrowth was thick and there was nothing to see, just trees and brush. Morrison said he understood, but he was thorough by nature and he'd like to see for himself. Thomas didn't argue. They approached the grove together, stopping at its edge. The undergrowth was indeed thick, a tangle of briars and saplings and deadfall. Morrison tried to push through, but it was difficult going, and after a few yards he stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking deeper into the grove, then turned back. "You're right," he said. "Nothing to see here. Just trees." But as they walked away, Morrison asked one more question. "How long has that grove been standing?" "As long as anyone remembers," Thomas said. "It was here when my grandfather bought the property, and it was probably here long before that." "Funny," Morrison said. "Most stands like that get cleared eventually, even if the wood isn't premium quality. Firewood, if nothing else. Seems like someone went to trouble to leave it standing." Thomas said nothing. They completed the walk and returned to the main house. Morrison thanked Samuel for his cooperation, said he appreciated the family's time, and left. He never returned to the property, and his investigation into the missing workers eventually stalled for lack of evidence. Years later, when Morrison was voted out of office after serving a single term, he mentioned to a friend that there were cases he'd never been able to solve, mysteries that still bothered him. The missing workers were among them. But he'd learned, he said, that sometimes the best you could do was know that something had happened, even if you couldn't prove it, even if you couldn't bring anyone to justice for it. After Morrison's visit, Samuel's health declined more rapidly. The stress of the interview, the fear that the past might finally come to light, the exhaustion of maintaining vigilance for so many years, it all seemed to catch up with him at once. By early 1899, he was bedridden more often than not. Catherine nursed him, and Thomas managed the property, and the younger children tried to make themselves useful without being in the way. Samuel died in March of 1899, at the age of 56. The cause was recorded as consumption, which was close enough to the truth to satisfy the requirements of the county register. He was buried in the Methodist cemetery in a plot he had purchased years earlier, in a service attended by family and a handful of neighbours who remembered him as a man who had kept to himself but had always paid his debts. Thomas stood at the grave and felt nothing particular. No grief exactly, though there was something like grief mixed with relief and exhaustion and a dull kind of anger that had no clear target. His father had carried the knowledge until he couldn't carry it anymore, had passed it to Thomas like an inheritance, and now Thomas was left with it, younger than his father had been when he received it, with more years ahead in which to carry it. After the funeral, Margaret asked Thomas if he planned to stay on the property. Thomas said he didn't see that he had much choice. Their mother couldn't manage it alone. The younger siblings needed support, and anyway, what else was he going to do? He had no education beyond what he'd learned on the farm, no particular skills, no connections beyond Harlan County. The property was his burden now, and he would carry it until it was someone else's burden, or until it ceased to be anyone's burden, because there was nothing left to burden anyone with. Margaret said she understood. Then she asked very quietly, "Does Mother know?" Thomas said he thought Mother knew what she needed to know and no more, that some women were good at knowing only what they could stand to know, and that Mother was one of those women. Margaret said nothing more. They stood together in the churchyard, watching the other mourners disperse, and then they went back to the property and the life that continued there in its diminished way. By 1900, the Pembridge property had been reduced to a fraction of its former productivity. Thomas worked it as best he could, but he was one person, and the land required more than one person could provide. The fields were mostly fallow. The outbuildings had collapsed. The main house was in disrepair. The property looked like what it was, a place where people were living but no longer thriving, where survival had replaced ambition, where the future was something to be endured rather than planned for. The younger Pembridge children, now young adults, began to leave. One went to work in a lumber camp, another to a factory town in Ohio, a third to a teaching position like Margaret's. They left not because they hated the property or their family, but because staying meant accepting the same burden their father and brother had accepted, and they could not quite bring themselves to do that. They understood, perhaps more clearly than Thomas or Margaret had at the same age, that the property was haunted not by anything supernatural, but by choices made long ago. Choices that continued to shape everything that happened there, choices that would continue to shape things until either the land was sold or everyone who knew about those choices was dead. Catherine died in 1903 after a long illness that left her bedridden and delirious toward the end. In her final days, she spoke of things that made no sense to the neighbors who helped Thomas care for her, but Thomas understood. She spoke of graves and secrets and the cost of keeping a family together. She spoke of her father-in-law, Samuel's father, whom she had never mentioned in life, describing him as a man who believed that some people weren't fully human and that treating them as such was not only acceptable, but necessary. She spoke of her husband, of his attempt to be better than his father, of his failure to be different enough, and she spoke of her children, of her hope that they would escape what she and Samuel had not escaped, that they would build lives untainted by the knowledge of what their grandfather had done and what their father had allowed to continue by his silence. Thomas sat by her bedside and listened and said nothing. When she died, he buried her next to Samuel in the Methodist cemetery, in a service that was smaller and quieter than Samuel's had been. The property, now his alone, felt larger and emptier than ever. For the next 28 years, Thomas Pembridge lived on the property in increasing isolation. He farmed enough to survive, sold what little surplus he could produce, and maintained the bare minimum required to keep the house standing. He never married, never had children, never developed close friendships with anyone in the county. He was known as a solitary man, neither friendly nor unfriendly, someone who kept to himself and expected others to do the same. The elm grove remained undisturbed. The trees grew older, thicker, more gnarled. The undergrowth became increasingly impenetrable. Animals continued to avoid it. Birds still rarely nested there. Children in the area, when they heard stories about the Pembridge property, were told that the grove was dangerous, that the ground was unstable, that there were old wells hidden in the undergrowth, that it was best to stay away. None of this was entirely true, but none of it was entirely false either. In 1924, when Thomas gave his deposition to the land surveyor, he was asked again about the grove. He gave the same explanation he had given Morrison 26 years earlier. The land was unsuitable for farming or timbering. It had always been left alone. There was nothing unusual about it. The surveyor, who was interested only in establishing property boundaries, accepted this without question. Thomas died in 1931 at the age of 50. The cause was recorded as heart failure, which was accurate enough. He was found in the main house by a neighbor who had stopped by to check on him after not seeing him for several weeks. The property, which had no other claimants, was eventually sold for unpaid taxes. The buyer was a lumber company that harvested what little valuable timber remained and then resold the land to a developer. The elm grove was cleared in 1935. The workers who cleared it found nothing unusual, just trees, undergrowth, and soil that was somewhat richer than the surrounding area, possibly because the grove had been left undisturbed for so long. If there were graves, they were not discovered, or if they were discovered, no report was made. The workers were paid to clear land, not to investigate what might be buried beneath it, and they did their job and moved on. By 1940, the area where the Pembridge property had stood was unrecognizable. The main house had been demolished. New structures had been built, the fields had been replanted or left to grow wild, the workers' cabins had been cleared away entirely. The only thing that remained from the old property was a section of stone wall that had marked one of the boundaries, and even that was beginning to crumble. Margaret died in 1947 at the age of 70. Among her possessions were her diary, her letters, and Thomas's final letter to her. These materials were kept by her niece, who eventually donated them to the County Historical Society, not because she understood their significance, but because they seemed like the kind of thing that historical societies collected. They sat in the Society's archives for years, largely unexamined, until a graduate student researching economic conditions in post-Civil War Appalachia came across them in 1987. The graduate student, whose name was Harriet Vance, was initially interested in the diary entries that dealt with farming practices and household management. But as she read further, she began to notice patterns, the oblique references, the careful silences, the places where Margaret seemed to be writing around something rather than about it. Vance, who had studied oral history and understood how families transmitted traumatic knowledge, recognized that she was looking at a record of something significant, even if she couldn't immediately determine what that something was. She cross-referenced Margaret's diary with county records, property records, census data, and tax rolls. She found the pattern of disappearances that Morrison had noticed. Workers who appeared in one census and vanished by the next, with no forwarding address, no records of death, no indication of where they had gone. She found the lawyer's notes about the odd way the property deed had been written, as though the elm grove had been deliberately excluded. She found Thomas's deposition, with its careful avoidance of any substantive explanation for why the grove had been left standing. Vance wrote her dissertation on what she called enforced amnesia in post-Civil War rural communities, using the Pembridge property as a case study. Her conclusion, carefully worded to avoid making claims she couldn't prove, was that something had happened on the property, something involving the deaths of workers, and that the family had maintained silence about it for 3 generations, transmitting the knowledge privately while publicly maintaining plausible deniability. Her dissertation was published in 1989. It was read by a few hundred people, mostly other academics, and was generally well received within its narrow field. It did not attract wider attention. The Pembridge property, which by then had been developed into residential housing, was not marked with any kind of historical notice. The elm grove, which no longer existed, was not memorialized. The people who lived on what had been Pembridge land had no idea of its history, and most would not have cared if they had known. In 2003, a real estate developer purchased a large parcel of land that included the area where the elm grove had stood. During excavation for a new subdivision, workers unearthed what appeared to be human remains. The county coroner was called. The remains were examined and determined to be old, certainly predating 1950, possibly much older. There were 8 sets of remains, buried without coffins, without markers, without any evidence of formal burial. The discovery made the local news. There was speculation about who these people might have been, how they had died, why they had been buried without proper ceremony. The coroner's report noted evidence of trauma on some of the skeletal remains, suggesting that at least some of these individuals had died violently. But the remains were too old for modern forensic techniques to provide much additional information. There was no DNA database to compare them against, no missing persons reports from that era that could be matched to the physical evidence. A local historian, aware of Vance's dissertation, contacted her to ask if there might be a connection to the Pembridge property. Vance reviewed her research and said it was possible, perhaps even likely, but that there was no way to prove it definitively. The remains could have been Pembridge workers. They could also have been from some other property, buried there for reasons that would never be known. The land had changed hands multiple times, had been used for various purposes, had been modified and developed to the point where it was impossible to say with certainty what had happened there 90 or 100 years ago. The remains were eventually reburied in the county cemetery in a section reserved for unidentified individuals. A small marker was placed reading, "Unknown persons died circa 1870-1890, discovered 2003. There was a brief ceremony attended by the county coroner, a representative from the Historical Society, and a few curious locals. No one from the Pembridge family attended, because no one from the Pembridge family remained in the area, and most of them didn't know about the discovery. The subdivision was built as planned. The houses sold quickly. The families who moved in were unaware that they were living on land where people had once been buried in unmarked graves, where a family had maintained silence for 3 generations, where children had grown up knowing they shouldn't tell. Life continued in its normal way, layered over the past, neither fully separate from it nor fully connected to it. In 2019, a genealogist researching the Pembridge family tree contacted the County Historical Society, asking for information about the family. She was working on behalf of a distant descendant who was curious about family history. The Historical Society provided copies of Margaret's diary, Thomas's deposition, and other available records. The genealogist read through them and noted in her final report to the client that the family appeared to have been unremarkable mountain farmers who experienced the typical hardships of the period. The client, a great-great-grandnephew of Margaret Pembridge, read the report with mild interest and filed it away. He had no particular connection to Harlan County, had never visited the area, had no reason to investigate further. The report contained nothing that suggested any unusual circumstances, any dark secrets, any reason to look more deeply into what his ancestors might have known, or done, or chosen not to speak of. And so the knowledge, which had been carried for 3 generations, with such care and such cost, finally dissolved into general historical amnesia. The Pembridge property became just another old farm in the mountains, notable only for appearing in a few academic papers and in the memories of elderly locals who had heard vague stories about it when they were young. The elm grove became a ghost of a grove, existing only in written records and in the memories of people who had never actually seen it. The workers who had disappeared became footnotes in census records, names without stories, people who had lived and died, leaving almost no trace beyond their brief appearance in official documents. The children who had grown up knowing they shouldn't tell were gone. The silence they had maintained was gone. Even the land itself was transformed beyond recognition. What remained was only the fact of absence, the shape of a story that could no longer be told because everyone who knew it was dead, and the documents that survived them were too fragmentary, too careful, too oblique to provide anything approaching a complete account. In the place where the Pembridge property had stood, where the elm grove had grown, where graves had been dug and kept secret, there were now houses with vinyl siding, lawns with above-ground pools, driveways with SUVs, fences with dogs. There were children playing in yards, riding bicycles on paved streets that followed no trace of the old property lines, living lives that were completely disconnected from what had happened on this ground more than a century ago. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was what Samuel Pembridge had understood when he chose silence over revelation. That time, more than anything else, erases history, that the past becomes less real with each passing generation, that eventually even the most terrible secrets become merely abstract possibilities, things that might have happened or might not have, stories without verification, ghosts without substance. The children grew up knowing they shouldn't tell. They carried that knowledge through their lives, transmitted it carefully to the next generation, maintained the boundary between what could be spoken and what must remain silent. And when they died, the knowledge died with them, just as Samuel had predicted it would. What remained was only the faint archaeological trace, the hints and suggestions, the fragments that scholars might piece together into approximate narratives, never quite certain, never quite complete. The land remembered nothing. The trees that had stood guard were gone. The people who might have told the truth were gone. What remained was only the fact that something had happened, somewhere to someone, and that other people had chosen to remain silent about it, and that their silence had been largely successful, accomplishing exactly what it was meant to accomplish. The protection of a family at the cost of truth, the maintenance of order at the cost of justice, the preservation of comfort at the cost of acknowledging what that comfort was built upon. And in the end, the question was not whether they had been right to keep silent. The question was whether being right or wrong even mattered, when the outcome was the same either way. The past buried, the present untethered from it, the future built on ground that held secrets it would never be required to reveal.